The rooftop of the Hargrove Tower smelled like old money and fresh lies. Evelyn Marsh noticed both the moment the elevator doors opened. That particular cocktail of expensive cologne, catered appetizers, and the kind of laughter that never quite reached anyone's eyes. The Chicago skyline glittered behind floor-to-ceiling glass, indifferent and magnificent, the way beautiful things always are when something ugly is about to happen below them. She smoothed the front of her navy dress, the one she'd bought 3 months ago specifically for tonight, the one her co-worker Dana had called brave, in that tone that meant the opposite, and stepped out onto the terrace. The Hartwell Capitol Anniversary Gala, 300 of Chicago's most carefully curated people, all of them dressed to signal things money couldn't actually buy. Evelyn had been invited because she was the firm's best forensic financial analyst, the woman who had quietly saved the company $4 million last quarter by catching a tax error no one else had seen. She had been invited, in other words, because she was useful. She was not here because anyone expected her to belong. You made it. Preston Whitmore appeared at her elbow with the timing of a man who had been watching the elevator. He was handsome in that aggressively maintained way, jaw sharp, hair product, smile like a press release. He'd been her boyfriend for 8 months. He kissed her cheek. I was starting to worry. Traffic on the bridge, Evelyn said. Right. He glanced at her dress. Not the way a man looks at a woman he loves. The way a man checks a spreadsheet for errors. You look nice. She had learned over 8 months that nice from Preston meant she had not embarrassed him yet. He steered her toward a cluster of people near the bar. Colleagues, clients, the kind of men whose business cards had titles that required explanation. Evelyn smiled at the right moments and said the right things and understood, the way she always understood, that she was being managed. Kept just close enough to be present, just far enough away to be dismissed if necessary. She was good at reading rooms. It was, professionally speaking, her greatest skill. What she was reading tonight made her chest tight. Preston had not introduced her to a single person. He had not refilled her drink when it ran empty. He had left her standing at the edge of a conversation 3 separate times to laugh at something across the room, and each time he drifted further before drifting back. She watched him work the room the way she watched balance sheets, tracking the pattern, finding the discrepancy. The discrepancy tonight was a woman in a red dress near the window, tall, polished. The kind of effortlessly beautiful that requires approximately $300 of effort per morning. Preston laughed at something she said. His hand touched the small of her back for exactly 2 seconds. Evelyn had been with the man long enough to know Preston Whitmore did not casually touch anyone. She set her empty glass on a passing tray and breathed through her nose. She was not going to cry at the Hartwell Capitol Anniversary Gala. She was not going to cause a scene. She was going to get another drink, find a quiet corner with a good view of the skyline, and give herself exactly 20 minutes to decide what to do with the information she had just collected. She turned toward the bar and walked directly into a wall. Except the wall was a man. He didn't move. Most people stumble back when they're walked into. This one simply stood there, 6 feet of absolute stillness, in a charcoal suit so well cut it looked like architecture, and looked down at her with eyes the color of deep water, gray-green, unreadable, the kind of eyes that had seen things and filed them away. I'm so sorry, Evelyn said automatically. You're not hurt? His voice was low, Chicago accent with something else underneath it. Something old world, precise. No, I wasn't watching where I was going. You were watching something. He glanced, briefly and without any particular curiosity, in the direction she'd come from, then back to her. Can I get you a drink? I was heading to the bar. So was I. He said it the way people state facts that don't require argument. His name, she would learn approximately 4 minutes later, was Caspian Wolf. She learned it not because he offered it, but because the bartender said, Mr. Bit, Wolf, with a particular deference reserved for people whose net worth had too many digits to be casually mentioned. Evelyn had done enough financial forensics to recognize the body language of money. She had just never seen so much of it concentrated in a single person standing this close to her. "You work at Hartwell," he said. It wasn't a question. Forensic analysis. She accepted the glass of sparkling water he'd ordered. She hadn't told him what she wanted, but somehow it was exactly right. "You? I have an interest in the firm." He said it the way people say things that are technically true and largely incomplete. Caspian Wolf. Evelyn Marsh. He nodded once. Not the nod of a man filing a name away. The nod of a man confirming something he already suspected. They stood at the bar for 11 minutes. She knew because she tracked it. In those 11 minutes, Caspian Wolf asked her 3 questions about her work. Not the polite surface questions people ask at parties, but specific, surgical questions that told her he already knew the answers and was interested in how she arrived at them. She found herself explaining her methodology for cross-referencing depreciation schedules across subsidiary accounts, which was not a sentence she had ever expected to say at a party, to a man who listened like it was the most interesting thing he'd heard all evening. "You caught the Meridian filing error," he said. She blinked. "That wasn't public." "No." He didn't elaborate. She should have found that unsettling. She found it, inexplicably, less unsettling than the way Preston had looked at her dress. Then Preston found her. She saw him coming from across the room. The slight tightening of his jaw when he registered who she was standing with, the recalibration of his smile to something more carefully calibrated. He arrived at her elbow with the smooth efficiency of a man who had decided to be charming on very short notice. "Evelyn." He put his hand on her back. "First time all evening. I was wondering where you'd gotten to." She said nothing. "Preston Whitmore." He extended his hand to Caspian, Senior VP of Client Relations. "Great event tonight, isn't it?" Caspian Wolf shook his hand with the expression of a man completing a formality. "Wolf." Something shifted in Preston's face. A recalibration of the recalibration. "Of course. Mr. Wolf, it's an honor." "Yeah." Caspian looked at Evelyn, not at Preston. At Evelyn with those deep-water eyes, direct and unhurried. "I was hoping to continue our conversation about the subsidiary analysis. Are you free for dinner Thursday?" The silence lasted approximately 2 seconds. Preston's hand on her back went very still. Yes," Evelyn said. "I can do Thursday." "Good." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card, heavy stock, minimal text, the way powerful things tend to be understated. "My assistant will send details in the morning." He nodded to her, barely acknowledged Preston, and walked away with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once in his life needed to rush toward anything because everything eventually came to him. Preston waited until Caspian was out of earshot. Then, what was that? "A conversation," Evelyn said. "Evelyn." His voice dropped. "Do you know who that is?" "Caspian Wolf." She picked up her sparkling water. "He seemed to know about the Meridian filing. He's Wolf Capital. He owns controlling interest in 7 financial firms, 2 of which directly compete with Hartwell. He doesn't have dinner with analysts, Evelyn. He doesn't." Preston stopped. Reorganized. His eyes moved over her face with an expression she recognized now, sharp and clear, the way things become clear once you decide to see them. He wasn't concerned. He was calculating. "What did you 2 talk about?" "Work," she said simply. She went home alone that night. She sat on her apartment floor in the navy dress she'd bought 3 months ago and stared at the card in her hand. Wolf Capital, C. Wolf, and a phone number, and told herself a number of reasonable things, that it was probably a professional dinner. That a man like Caspian Wolf had not looked at her the way she thought he'd looked at her. That she was projecting because she'd just spent 3 hours watching her boyfriend touch another woman's back. She believed approximately none of it. She went to dinner on Thursday. The restaurant was on the 42nd floor of a building she'd walked past 100 times without knowing what was inside it. Caspian was already seated when she arrived. She was 7 minutes early. He'd clearly been there longer. He stood when she approached the table, She couldn't remember the last time a man had stood when she approached a table. "You look," he began. "Please don't say nice," she said before she could stop herself. He paused. Something almost like amusement moved through his eyes. "I was going to say formidable." She sat down. The dinner lasted 3 hours. They talked about financial architecture, about the specific pleasure of finding patterns in data that other people had declared random, about a paper she'd written in graduate school that she had not listed on her professional resume because she'd assumed no one relevant would have read it. He had read it. He quoted the 3rd paragraph from memory. "Why are you having dinner with me?" she asked, somewhere around the 2nd hour. "Because you're the most interesting person at Hartwell Capital," he said, "and I'm considering acquiring them." She looked at him. "That's the professional reason." "Yes. And the other reason?" He was quiet for a moment. He had, she'd noticed, a particular quality of stillness. Not the stillness of someone who didn't know what to say, but the stillness of someone who chose every word like a chess move. "I watched you for 40 minutes before you walked into me," he said. "I watched you stand at the edge of every conversation. I watched you carry a drink you weren't enjoying and smile at people who weren't paying attention to you. And I watched the moment you made a decision. Something shifted in your face very quickly and you turned toward the bar. I wanted to know what you decided." Evelyn said nothing for a long moment. "That's not a normal thing to say," she told him. "No," he agreed. "I'd decided to give myself 20 minutes to figure out what to do about my boyfriend. The man who touched your back like a prop." The word landed with surgical precision. She felt it go in. "Yes," she said quietly. "What did you decide?" "I haven't yet." She looked at her wineglass. "But I'm close." She broke up with Preston the following Tuesday. Not because of Caspian. She was precise about this in her own mind, the way she was precise about everything. She broke up with Preston because of the 8 months of data she'd been collecting and refusing to fully analyze. The red dress woman was only the most recent data point. Preston did not take it well. He took it specifically to their mutual colleagues. By Thursday morning, 3 people had approached Evelyn with variations of sympathetic looks that contained something else underneath them. The slight uncomfortable pleasure people take in witnessing a fall. Someone had mentioned, casually, that Preston was telling people she'd become difficult after she started having delusions about her importance to the firm. By Friday, the story had a footnote. She'd apparently been throwing herself at clients. She read the situation the way she read everything. Clearly. Completely. Without the comfort of pretending it was something other than what it was. She had dinner with Caspian again that Saturday. "I broke up with him," she said when they were seated. "I know." He didn't explain how. "And he's running a campaign. I'm aware. It won't work." He said it the same way he said everything, not as reassurance, but as analysis. "You don't know that. I know that Hartwell Capital's senior VP of Client Relations has a pending review for expense account irregularities that my team flagged 8 weeks ago." He picked up the menu. "I haven't decided what to do with that information yet." Evelyn stared at him. Are you telling me you're protecting me?" He looked up from the menu. "I'm telling you what I know. What you do with it is your business." "Why?" The stillness again. "Then because someone should have been paying attention to you a long time ago, Evelyn, and the fact that they weren't is their catastrophic mistake, not yours." She looked at him across the white tablecloth and the candlelight and understood something she had been carefully not understanding for 3 weeks. This man, this extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily complicated man, was looking at her. Not at who she might become if she changed certain things. Not at the version of herself that would be more convenient. At her, exactly as she was. The way she sat and thought and talked about depreciation schedules at parties. The body she'd spent 31 years making peace with. The mind she'd spent 31 years being quietly furious that people kept overlooking. She thought, "I am in significant trouble." She was right. The acquisition of Hartwell Capital was announced 6 weeks later. Caspian did not offer Evelyn a corner office in the restructure. He offered her the newly created position of Chief Financial Integrity Officer, a title that had not existed before and that carried, as she eventually understood it, exactly as much authority as she wanted it to. She said she needed a week to think about it. He gave her a week. On the 5th day, he appeared at the coffee shop 2 blocks from her apartment building, which she had not told him she frequented. "You're doing that thing," she said when he sat down across from her. "What thing?" "Knowing where I am." "You walked by at 8:47 and 8:53 on Monday," he said. "I assumed you'd be here again. You were watching my building." A pause. "I was in the neighborhood." "Caspian." He looked at her. The deep-water eyes, direct and unhurried. "I wanted to see you," he said. "I didn't want to call because I didn't want you to think it was about the position." "Is it about the position?" "No." She looked at her coffee. "This is complicated." "Yes. You're acquiring the company I work for." "I'm aware." "And you are, whatever you are. You own things. You know things before you should know them. Men at bars say your name like they're afraid of it. Does that bother you?" She considered it honestly. She was, above most things, honest with herself. "No," she said finally. "It bothers me that it doesn't bother me." Something changed in his face then. Not a smile exactly, but the near approximation of one, the kind of expression she suspected he didn't produce very often, and perhaps had not been expecting to produce right now. It made him look for exactly 1 second like a man who had wanted something for a long time and was surprised to find himself close to it. "Take the position," he said, "or don't. That's entirely separate." "And the other thing?" "The other thing," he said, "I'd like to discuss over dinner, if you'll let me." She took the position. They had dinner. The Preston Whitmore situation resolved itself with the efficiency of a well-documented paper trail. The expense irregularities that Caspian's team had flagged led to an internal audit, which led to 3 years of irregularities that had nothing to do with Evelyn and everything to do with Preston's particular brand of confidence, the kind that makes a person believe they're too charming to be caught. He resigned before the board could formalize anything. The story he'd been telling about Evelyn evaporated the way those stories do when the person telling them no longer has institutional standing to give them gravity. She did not feel triumphant about this. She felt something quieter and more durable, the particular relief of a wrongly filed equation finally corrected. What she had not anticipated was the morning that Caspian's name appeared in the financial press alongside a photograph and a headline that described him as Chicago's most formidable private equity architect and famously private in all matters personal. The article was 3 paragraphs of faux professional history and 1 paragraph that noted, with the careful neutrality of journalists who know they're touching something hot, that Wolf Capital's new Chief Financial Integrity Officer had recently been seen at 3 separate public events with the company's founder. Her phone had 17 texts by 9 a.m. 3 from colleagues, 2 from her mother, 1 from a college roommate she hadn't heard from in 4 years, and 1, placed precisely in the middle, from a number she didn't recognize that said only, "I heard you landed on your feet." Must be nice to have connections. She knew the handwriting of that particular spite, even in a text message. "Preston." She set the phone down, picked it back up, typed, "It must be. Take care." Sent it. Blocked the number. Then she went to the office. Her office, her own, with a view of the same Chicago skyline she'd stared at from a rooftop 2 months ago, and got to work. Caspian appeared in her doorway at noon. He did this occasionally without announcement, which she had stopped protesting because it had become somehow one of the more reliable parts of her day. "The Northbrook subsidiary analysis," he said, setting a folder on her desk. "I know. I've been through it twice. There's a transfer pattern in Q3 that doesn't match the reported acquisition timeline." He sat down across from her. "Show me." She showed him. They spent 40 minutes in the particular communion of two people who find the same things beautiful, the patterns in numbers, the stories the data tells when you're patient enough to listen. At some point, she realized she was explaining something with her hands, and he was watching her hands the way he'd watched her across the rooftop bar 2 months ago, like she was solving a problem he'd been sitting with for a long time. "Evelyn," he said. She stopped. "What?" "I need to tell you something that isn't about the Northbrook subsidiary." "All right." "I have not been straightforward about the initial dinner." She waited. The acquisition of Hartwell was already decided before the gala. The professional dinner was genuine, but it was not the only reason I asked. He looked at her with the directness that she had stopped finding unsettling and had started finding quietly necessary. "I'd read your work for 2 years before I walked into that rooftop bar. I knew who you were. I wanted to meet you." The room was very quiet. "You engineered walking into me," she said. "You were heading toward the bar. I was already there." A pause. "I may have positioned myself. That's—" She stopped, considered. "That's actually something I should probably be more unsettled by." "You're not?" "I'm trying to be." She looked at the folder between them, the neat columns of numbers that told their quiet stories. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted you to make every decision you made without the weight of knowing someone was already certain." "Certain of what?" "Of you," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who knew where she bought her coffee, who had read her graduate thesis, who had watched her carry a drink she wasn't enjoying at a party and decided, somewhere in those 40 minutes, that he wanted to know what she was going to do next. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer it honestly." "Always." "Would any of this, the position, what's happened between us, would it have been the same if I looked different?" He didn't answer immediately. She respected that. She would have trusted the immediate answer less. "The position," he said carefully, "exists because of your mind. Full stop. That has no other variable." He paused. "As for the rest, I watched you for 40 minutes, Evelyn. I watched you navigate a room that didn't deserve you. I watched the way you carried yourself. Not the way you were trying to, not the performance of it, but the underneath of it. The actual you." His voice was quiet. "I don't know how to separate what you look like from who you are. They're the same person." She exhaled slowly. "That," she said, "is a better answer than I expected." "I've been thinking about how to say it for some time." She almost smiled. "That tracks." Outside her window, Chicago went about its magnificent and different business, the lake steel gray in the November light, the bridges and the towers and the traffic that never stopped. 2 months ago, she'd stood on a rooftop in a dress she'd bought to prove something and watched a man she'd been trying to make love her and felt herself disappear quietly by degrees. She thought about that version of herself, standing at the edge of every conversation, carrying the drink she wasn't enjoying. She didn't think about her with pity. She thought about her with something more like gratitude. For enduring. For deciding. For walking toward the bar. "I owe you a correction," she told Caspian. "What correction?" "The night we met. I walked into you." "You did. You said you'd positioned yourself." "I said I may have." "Caspian." The not-quite smile again, more visible now than the first time she'd seen it, like a thing that was getting less work to produce. "I knew where you were heading. I may have ensured I was in the way. That's premeditated." "It is." "And everything since then?" He looked at her across her desk, across the folder of numbers that told their story and the November light and the 2 months of dinners and data and a version of herself she was only now meeting fully. "Everything since then," he said, "has been entirely your choice." She thought about that. Let it sit, turned it over the way she turned over every piece of information, fully, without flinching, until she understood what it actually was. What it actually was, a man who had been paying attention, precise, deliberate, unnerving attention, the kind she had spent 31 years suspecting she deserved, and never quite finding. "I'm going to need you to stop appearing in my doorway unannounced," she said. "All right. Starting next week." Something moved in his eyes. Next week. "I have a lot of work to get through this week," she said, "and I find it difficult to concentrate when you're in the room. I'll take that as encouragement." "Take it however you like," she told him. "Just close the door on your way out." He stood, straightened his jacket, picked up the Northbrook folder and set it on the corner of her desk in precisely the spot she would have put it. At the door, he paused. "Evelyn. For the record," he said, "I find it equally difficult." He left. The door clicked shut. She sat in the November light with Chicago laid out below her and thought about the rooftop 2 months ago. The navy dress, the empty glass, the 40 minutes she hadn't known she was being watched. Then she pulled the Northbrook file toward her, opened it to page 4, and got back to work. Because some things had changed completely, and some things did not change at all, and she had always known, in the deepest and most reliable part of herself, exactly which was which.